in this session, we're going to have some nourishment with ideas. And when I was planning this event on waste to be held in Sydney, who else could I have thought of to come and join the discussion, if not Professor Gay Hawkins, who has really been, I think I called you the doyen of waste studies on Friday, and I'm sorry, that's probably not the most polite way of putting it. Just an incredibly productive researcher on this topic for so long, and a pioneer, really. I mean, I remember as a junior academic realizing that this area was taking off largely because of Gay's leadership, and her book in 2006, The Ethics of Waste, has been an influential early defining text for many of us thinking about these topics, and in my case, much later thinking about these topics. Gay and I were also colleagues for a short amount of time at the University of Queensland at the Centre for Critical and Cultural Studies. And so it's another wonderful connection to be able to reanimate today as we have this conversation on the topic of waste. So the immediate relevance of the topic for Gay is a major project with colleagues titled Investigating Innovative Waste Economies, Redrawing the Circular Economy. So right in the wheelhouse, as they say. And for 2023 to 24, she is scholar in residence at the Powerhouse Museum, working with a team designing a major exhibition on plastics as kin. And it's really the history of thinking about plastics that is why I really wanted Gay to come along today, if possible, because she has this wonderful collaboration on the book Plastic Water. Yeah, that's the genius of the title, right? Plastic Water. And we're going to actually go into some detail about that today, partly because, as Cameron also showed us, there's a long history of thinking about some of the problems that we've heard about this morning on the personalization of the problem of consumption, and also the disposability dimension that has been created by the industry itself, the benefits and the drawbacks of that. So we're going to have a conversation for about 20 minutes. I know I keep saying that. So we'll see if we can get there. But just to sort of start off the conversation in a pretty approachable way, Gay, I'm just wondering if you could reflect a bit on what you've heard this morning, and particularly, I know we were trying to think about the differences between recycling and reuse in this session. So has anything changed in your thoughts about recycling and reuse, given what you've seen so far?
Oh, my mind is racing. It's been fantastic. I mean, it's great to see a focus on reuse, because I think that it's really time to displace recycling and the sort of environmental myths that surround it as a sort of effective solution to waste. And that's particularly just fundamental to anyone who's thinking about plastics, because plastics are just so difficult and toxic to recycle, and the vast majority of them aren't recycled. So the idea that something's recyclable when you handle a plastic bottle or whatever just is completely unsustainable and completely untrue. Because in Plastic Water, we got access to the plastics villages, which is where the plastics in Hanoi are recycled, and they're these on the peri-urban fringe, where you see these sort of hundreds of small businesses, really often family-owned businesses, that are just trying to break down consumer plastics, mainly packaging, but also hospital plastics. And it's a really confronting thing to see, because in that book we also went and saw how plastic bottles were made, and you know, they're made in about a microsecond, stretch blown. You get a little pellet, it's stretch and blown into a bottle, and there you've got it, and then it's instantly filled. When you try and break that bottle down, recycle it, the kind of consumer life of that object meets its waste afterlife, and the whole process is incredibly difficult. They're designed to be light and durable in use, in consumer use. Confronting that when you try and recycle them is really challenging. They're also often composite materials, so you've got to cut off the top of the bottle because it's a different plastic, it'll contaminate the batch. You've then got to try and smash that really hard beverage bottle, and then you've got to shred it, and there's plastic flakes going everywhere and toxins running into the local water stream, whatever have you. So the idea that recycling is getting back to a raw material that's usable is, I just find that really, we cannot live on that myth anymore, because and it just shows you how much the recycling discourse is driven by a kind of extractivist logic that, oh, here's a bottle, this has got lost value, let's extract it and do something else with it. And I think that whole extractivist discourse that surrounds recycling, value's just there to be found, all we've got to do is extract it, is impossible. Because I guess the other final issue about plastics recycling is it's still the aftermarkets for plastic feedstock that's come from recycling plastics are very uneven. As we've seen here in Australia with the collapse of RedCycle, huge storehouses of disposable packaging, plastic packaging that could not be recycled because there's simply no markets for it. And the industry, the packaging industry, for example, still far prefers to use virgin feedstocks coming from the fossil fuel industry. It's cheaper, it's quicker, there's standards issue is much more easy to manage. So recycling, the big challenge to recycling is here, it's arrived, and it's a really important moment politically and environmentally.
Okay, so that should have whet your appetite for more of the details on what recycling really is. Because I think the thing that really struck me about reading the stories of the so-called recyclers is again getting to the point that we raised earlier today about where does it happen. So if you put the bottle in a recycling bin, or even a bin as we have out the front of this room saying that it will be sorted after you dispose, so no need for you to worry about whether it is a recycling bin. Where does it go after that? And as consumers, we don't necessarily get that full story. So I was wondering, Gay, if you could tell us just a little bit more detail about some of those. It's not just the waste pickers, but it's the people that have a livelihood based on creating plastic in this later form that then does make it potentially valuable. What's their life like?
I've only looked at recyclers in Vietnam. That's quite a while ago. I haven't looked at plastics recycling in Australia, where I'm sure it's far more mechanised, though there is still, you know, a significant amount of labour that's used, that's going through recycling bins that are then emptied into facilities where there's a process line where people are picking out and calculating which plastics go where, which stuff's going to contaminate the batch, all of that. In Vietnam, you're right, there's a whole chain of workers who are involved in recovery. So there's people that would be making a really sort of subsistence livelihood in Hanoi that are just picking up anything plastic that they think could be recyclable. They're then on selling it to a small business based in Hanoi that's collecting and buying from them. And that small business would be sorting it, bundling it, often crushing it so it's easy to transport, and then they get taken out to the plastics villages and delivered to various small businesses. The ones that are actually doing the recycling, the family businesses, when I went there, they were doing quite well because there's still quite a demand for plastics feedstock. Since 2017, when China introduced its green sword policy. There's just a huge oversupply of recycled plastics. You know, the world is producing more plastics that can ever be recycled. So when China shut down importing recyclable plastics and said to all the countries that were basically dumping their waste offshore, you deal with it, I think that there's been, obviously the industry here would have really had to expand and take off. And that's one of the issues that's coming up a lot with the discussion around the circular economy, that we need to do recycling better. We need to recycle more plastics. And the problem with that is that the circular economy just becomes a sort of smokescreen for advanced recycling. It doesn't really force you to look at how our economy is organised. How could you eliminate single-use plastics? How could you redesign economies around reuse, secondary markets, which is what the electronics industry seems to be far more advanced in.
Well, that's very generous. You're getting there. So your work also shows in that process how products themselves resist dematerialization. That's another big word for a process which really allows the thing to push back, given the way that it's been designed. So this, in the case of the bottled water, was everything from the way that the lid was a different plastic to the bottle itself, or the lip being a particular kind of obdurate design and style, and also just the translucency of the plastic in that bottle sense. So since writing that book and given the other projects you've been doing, have you seen other examples that are better of designing for reuse coming out?
Well, now, look, one of the things about Vietnam, all those plastics were basically going to be downcycled. They were just going to be made into more pretty shoddy plastic materials, outdoor furniture, plastic bags, things like that. So they're not really reducing the burden of plastic objects in the world. They're just generating more. Coat hangers was a big favourite. What the current project that I'm working on now with Abby, who's here, and Stephen Healy and Ruth Lane and Anissa Madden, is looking at innovative waste economies. So economies that are trying to manage and innovate around the fact of waste, because all economies are going to be producing excess waste, surplus. So the issue that we're interested in that project is how are they doing that, and how are they doing it beyond that sort of neat, very appealing idea of circularity. And there's just huge amounts of social innovation around working with and without waste. So we're looking at 3 waste streams: plastics, organics, and mattresses. In plastics, that's where I've become really interested in reuse and the whole idea of how you generate reuse value in an economy, how you organise a business to really foreground reuse and establish logistics and relationships that facilitate it and make it convenient and profitable. And that's actually pretty hard, I must say. And the one that Anissa and I have been looking at very, very closely is this company called Returner in Melbourne, which is it's an online shopping platform, business to consumer shopping delivery system, which is trying to eliminate single-use packaging. And they're using durable stainless steel containers that the goods get delivered to the household in. Once they're used up, then they get picked up, taken back to an industrial cleaning site that Returner manages, refilled by the supplier, and then delivered back again. So it's a really interesting example of building a reuse economy, and the central material object in it is those durable stainless steel food containers. Because the owner of this business, Jamie Forsyth, who's an entrepreneurial dynamo that talks at about 1,000 words an hour. He's fantastic. The whole business, the brand value is no single use. So it's not, oh, we've got recyclable packaging, or, you know, be a good environmental citizen. He is really trying to build the business around reuse is the only way in which you can develop an effective challenge to single-use packaging. That we've seen the failure of recycling with that material. So he's really, and he's quite a philosophizer. He has really thought long and hard, not just about the logistics and organisation of this, but where and how is value being done in reuse. So reuse value, I think, is a really interesting concept.
I was going to say, it's something that you pointed out in our discussions before today, that recycling and reuse have different logistical infrastructure. And you do need to have a philosophical change in order for that to really work.
Yeah. And to me, the big philosophical change is recycling is still driven by what I would call an extractivist logic of value. That is, you have to find it and discover it and extract it. And reuse value is built around the idea of how can we keep the usefulness of something alive and generative all the way through every step of that supply chain and system. And so it's a shifting from extracting value to generating value at every step of the use of that container.
Accruing value too. So thinking of Cameron's point about whether you make the previous user's presence more visible or less, and the extent to which that creates another kind of value or distinction.
Absolutely. So that, you know, that, and Cameron's paper is a perfect setup for mine, because what in the return ask system, the consumer gets these sort of stainless steel containers. Once they've used them, they have to wash them and put them back on their doorstep. So then they're thinking about the next use, and they have to engage in a little bit of labour to facilitate the next use, which is pick up and return to their sort of industrial cleaning facility. And at that industrial cleaning facility, they're thinking about the next use, which is making sure that they're perfectly dry before they go to the supplier and they're refilled. And then the refiller, the supplier, has to make sure that they're perfectly, the lid's on perfectly, so that they, when they get stacked in the delivery truck, they're not going to all spill and come open. So each user of that container, as they are reusing it, has a particular set of actions that ensures that they're handing it on to the next use or next element in the sort of logistical chain, and making sure that they're going to facilitate the usefulness in the next part of the process. So this is sort of, they're maintaining what I would call the tangible instrumentality of that container, so that it can participate in the next action, whether it's industrial cleaning or being filled. So everyone in that chain, in that logistical chain, contributes a little bit of labour to that durable container that allows it to keep circulating. And in that process of circulation, reuse value is just being done over and over again. So it's a form of value that's about repeating and returning. It's cyclical value. It's not single-use value. It's not used up in one hit.
Yeah, in the act of consumption by one person.
Yeah.
So, okay. I now wanted to make a bit of a connection with the talk from Adam earlier today and just the general topic of waste, because we have been talking a little bit about value in that example. In your previous work, a lot of what I learnt was the intricacies of how waste is valued by not just the recyclers, but those who are doing the gathering, and how much this calculation process is tactile. and almost intuitive because it's physicality. And the reason I thought that was an interesting point to develop today was we're here because of a centre on automated decision-making in society. And as we think about the sheer volumes of waste, whether it's plastics or electronics or textiles, etc., how will we be teaching machines to make those calculations? Is it even possible for robots or algorithms to learn how to do that calculation that you've seen so intricately that humans perform?
Oh, I'm sure, and I'm sure it's already happening. And I think Rowley and Hong's work shows very clearly that waste is being datafied and tracked and automated in terms of collection, sorting, what's got value, what hasn't got value. That's really quite, I would say, a very advanced process. With plastics, I'm not sure, because I think that one of the things that's interesting about Returner, this small business, is that most of the, and this is Jamie, the director of this company's eternal frustration. He doesn't like the fact that all the consumers, most of his consumers, most of the people in this market are there because they want to be good environmental citizens and they hate waste. So they don't like doing their shopping, and when they finish it or put it all away, there's a great big pile of single-use plastics on the kitchen bench. They hate that. So they've got this kind of environmental ethic which they don't want to waste. Therefore they're very good recyclers, but they've realised the limits of recycling. But he's now trying to get them to shift to reuse is a much more profound and sustainable environmental contribution. And that means that they are going to have to make much more serious commitments to engaging with the packaging because it's durable. So they have to wash it, they have to look after it a bit. So their sort of calculations are very much based on those actions and practices, are kind of training them to see what reuse is and how it's much more valuable for sort of the economy and the environment than just carefully sorting and chucking all your food packaging in the recycling bin. So the sort of whole ethos of the company is design and uses. That's what he's valuing, and that's how they promote it. But in terms of other wastes, huge amounts of automation going on. But again, you're only going to invest in automated collecting and sorting if there's markets for those materials. So, and I would say that those sort of investments are significant. And at the moment, it's still very heavily labour-based, and it's often involved, as Adam showed, in countries where there's labour is very cheap and where there's a highly skilled workforce able to identify and relate to materials and the composition of devices, in a very intimate and effective way, and to dismantle very, very carefully.
Right. Yeah, you mentioned markets, and this is another term that's a big term for you in your work, and I've learned a lot about it from you, because it seems as though some of the early STS work in waste studies draws on that vocabulary somewhat, because just as there is a market for reuse that you're describing now in its nascent form, there needed to be a market for disposability as well, right? So I was wondering if you've got lessons that you've learned from studying so much that process of turning consumers into subjects that are comfortable with disposing things after one use, and what you think the market is going to be for this new class of citizen that's going to need to be deft at reusing, and how are we going to get there?
God, well, I mean, look, one of the things about markets and why STS is so interesting is that it just breaks away from, I guess, a kind of critique of capitalism as always already bad. It's really committed to looking at a sort of anthropology of markets. How are they organised? How are they doing value? Who's involved? What devices are used? How do you economise something? And I guess what all the first thing I'll say is that what all the talks this morning showed was that it's in all these markets and examples we've looked at, it is never just economic value that's being done. It's always so many other orders of worth that's being generated. So more up's looking at how they can support social enterprises and contribute to the digital divide. So it is, it's generating civic value just by the organisation of that business and market, in the same sense that it's helping large-scale corporations meet their sustainable development goals. So I think the critical, really valuable thing about STS approaches to markets is that they show you that economies are social, that they're complex, that they're material, and that they need to be studied as the kind of anthropological sites, and that value is something that has to be done, has to be provoked, generated. It's not just fixed and intrinsic ever. In terms of disposability, well, I mean, plastic has inaugurated the throwaway society. I mean, there's no question about that. And what's interesting about plastic and the history of plastic is that there's a moment in the early history of plastic where it's praised for its durability, the fact that it's never going to break down, it's better than nature, it's going to be there forever. How fantastic is that? And then you get a moment where the plastics industry realizes, well, we're never going to make money out of that. We need turnover. We need serial replacement. We need to be selling more and more plastic things. So that's when you get the rise of disposable plastic objects and the growth of food packaging, especially as a major site for the expansion of the industry post-World War II. And there's no question that had enormous benefits for food security and food safety and all those really critical issues like that. It's part of the great acceleration of populations and objects in the world. But one thing that shift in the meaning of the material was that what the industry had to say to consumers was, we want you to stop thinking about this material as durable and unbreakable. We now want you to think about it as disposable. So it very much, that's the rise of when you get incredibly light, film-like plastics, transparent, they seem barely there, they're very ephemeral in the supply chain and logistics. You just sort of touch them briefly and then they're ripped off and you don't really see them again. So the critical point I'm trying to get to is that what that new economy of building new markets with plastic focused on, it enhanced different qualities in the material. Those qualities were always there, but it really amplified them to make plastic disposable and to allow plastic to say to consumers, we're really a thin surface. You don't need to worry. It's easy to throw us out, throw this material out. Previously, the focus was on saying to consumers, it's durable, it won't scratch, it's unbreakable. Those material qualities were amplified in the early markets of plastic. In the post-war markets for plastic, completely different material qualities were amplified. So markets make certain material qualities visible and other ones get backgrounded.
It's so ironic because now, just speaking on the electronics side of the equation, now one of the first things that manufacturers are doing is eliminating their plastic packaging when they're trying to reach their sustainability goals. Next time you buy a computer, you'll struggle to see any plastic in anything that it's delivered in, because it's one of the first things that they can now eliminate to reduce the amount of plastics they're using. And then there's another connection that you just made me think of, which may not be that well known to this audience, but when computer manufacturers talk about the difficulties of creating a durable product, one that would be more circular or it would last longer. One of the things that we're always told as advocates for sustainable design is, well, people want thin and light laptops. People want thin and light laptops. And this is a market demand that since the Ultrabook was invented and the MacBook Air, there is no turning back, and that consumers expect this lightness in the object, in the thing. And of course, the implication of that is that it has to be soldered and glued together, just like the mobile phones. Durability is also ensured by soldering and many, many forms of plastic glues to make sure it's waterproof. So I feel like we continue to be struggling with some of these same problems of the personal preferences of individuals who are going to be on the go with their laptops, then create these design constraints that make them very difficult to then disassemble and then put into this secondary market.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And one of the things about scaling up reuse is precisely those design challenges. And the other challenge with scaling up reuse is that markets are driven by brand differentiation.
Yes.
Often the most minor but critical signifiers that say this is an Apple, not a Dell. So what's essential to enabling reuse to scale up is certain forms of standardization that can allow things to be returned centrally reconfigured in ways that are, cost efficient.
Yep.
So that's a real challenge, I think. And I don't know how you tackle it. It's a huge challenge in the packaging sector, where there are large investments in trying to scale up reuse. But, one of the issues there is how do you get branding, how do you get labeling? All those things have to be completely redesigned to allow a certain sort of logistical system that is convenient and cost effective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of the prompts for the research that I was doing on secondary use for PCs was when I went to do fieldwork for this laptop campaign, this design that became the EVO brand. And we were doing research in Europe, and a lot of the young people were quite resentful that they had to upgrade their PCs as often as they were made to believe they had to by manufacturers. And so the most compelling slide from that presentation that I gave was the one where I had the really cool influencer who needed a great laptop to be able to make all her social media content. And she said in this quote that she would rather buy a secondhand laptop than to have to buy one that's not sustainable. And so it was this opening that the fieldwork gave us to start the conversation on what do you have to do differently to convince someone whose own brand credibility rests on being a sustainable influencer and market maker herself. So it's really interesting the way that this next generation is putting pressure on the existing and traditional design approaches.
Yeah, because as you say, where they're at now is, we're going to reduce plastic packaging because plastic's got such a bad reputation. Or, we're going to talk about our sustainable development goals and how we're ticking all those boxes. That the new level of consumers is just not satisfied with that.
Yeah.
So that the demand for reuse is actually hopefully going to grow.
So I have one more question before we make this a little more democratic. And I think a number of us were hoping this afternoon to get more in detail about the circular economy plans that our local and federal government here in Australia seems to be quite enthusiastic about. But I suppose, Gay, given your experience working in this area for many years, how do you see this current framing of sustainability in government policy and in business? And it seems almost like there is an agreement that circularity is the word we're going to use. What are some of the logistical problems that is continuing to obscure that perhaps people here at this event can help make visible?
Circularity is acquiring the same resonance as community. It just must be good. there's nothing wrong with it. And it sort of this drove this project because we were all really frustrated with the kind of dominant rhetoric around circularity in Australia, which was often just closet advanced manufacturing. It was just like, how can we improve recycling? how can we, extract more materials? How can we do business as usual, only better? So the other rationale for it is often jobs and growth. This is going to be the new green industries, sustainable capitalism, all the rest of it. And it's or a very technocratic notion of, we need to be able to extract more value out of resources or keep them going for longer or whatever. So the whole discourse just denies the complexity of circulation, which is what we've seen in all the talks this morning. The sort of logistics and networks that need to be in place to allow things to have extended lives, to allow them to be reused in the same way that they were intended. And so and our project was driven by trying to look at the sociality of circularity, all the sort of social and civic elements that are in place. The other thing about the circular economy policy and discourse in Australia, it is just completely blind to the huge range of civic organisations, small-scale charities, social enterprises that have been doing circularity for so long, that have been generating second-hand economies, reusing stuff. So it just, that whole sector, which is big all around the world, has just been completely sidelined. We're not learning any lessons from them. And it just seemed to me that nor was the focus enough on looking at how economies can be redesigned, reorganised logistically through the ways in which they generate value. And in relationship to plastics, the debate has kind of stalled at better recycling and plastic packs. There is just not enough discussion about reuse or elimination design. So there's a long way to go, I think.
Not such a positive message, is it? So I think if there is something redeeming to be taken from these observations and others we heard this morning is you're completely right that in the electronic space, to use that example, those who have been doing refurbishment for many years are now starting to have the ability to claim what they do as having a kind of value that corporations are being forced to count. So ESG, meaning environmental and social governance, includes a lot of the social benefits of things like making that laptop that was your company's laptop available for somebody who's getting it refurbished by a nonprofit, who will then be able to, this person will now be able to apply for a job, because most services and job applications now require a computer to really participate and to go through. So what I'll show a little bit later today is some examples of how these different nonprofits and for-profit businesses are having to talk about the value of the social and the community impacts that they have, which is relocalizing some of the benefits of what companies and organizations can provide. But it's almost like having to chase your tail, really, if you're in one of those organizations, to just keep redefining what you do according to the fashionable language. And unfortunately, in the US setting, this ESG language is now facing a big backlash, because there's some quite concerted campaigns from right-wing politicians to put it in part of the broader woke agenda that is influencing the way that companies operate. So we could go into a lot more detail about that, but I'm interested to know if there are other questions that people in the room would like to ask either of us, because Gay is really here as the expert on all of the conceptual language that accompanies these traditions. But obviously I'm here if we need to talk about electronics.
But don't you think that sounds a little bit cynical, that the big companies are only talking to the sort of social and civic sector because they've got to get their ESG sort of brownie points up?
I may be cynical.
No, I'm sure that's a legitimate assessment, but I think often other things go on in those exchanges, which is important to recognise, because I think that it's a problem to see the sort of civic social enterprise sector as a kind of alternative economy or a marginal economy. They're all kind of interconnected in really interesting ways. And the more those interconnections can be extended, the more those large corporates change. No. It's a question I ponder myself. What's the relationship of those sort of small businesses, social enterprises that are really trying to do different things and generate economic difference, in a sense, to large-scale corporates? And I don't think it's the sort of, this is the centre of economic action and then there's the fringes. I think we've got to get away from that.
Yeah. It's what we were trying to talk about in our description for the event as a productive parasitism, where you have this way of making use of the discards of the organisations, but that also has benefits for the organisation too.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that is what ESG was always supposed to be about.
Yeah.
Okay,
Well,
Brett, you've been patient while we continue talking.
Yeah, I'm just interested in the scaling up part of scaling up reuse. And, you know, when I hear about the returner example, I'm thinking, well, the metal container is not something new to logistics.
It's very new in food packaging.
Yeah, sure. But when you scale up container shipping, you have the problem of the empty container. And eventually you get to a scale where it's cheaper to make a new metal container to take from China to the west coast of the US than to ship back all the metal containers that are going to the US west coast to China to be refilled. So there is a problem in scaling up. So if you're thinking about scale in that classical geographical sense, on the other hand, we live in a very interconnected economy. And, you know, when Mel talks about relocalizing, you know, I mean, that's a proposition. But can you scale up and relocalize at the same time?
Oh, I'm not sure that you can actually, and that's a really good question to pose to us. But that there is a huge amount of work going on around reverse logistics, and that's often driven by really interesting debates around value and calculations around the amount of fuel to return empty trucks or containers. So the sort of calculability of energy in empty space is a really fascinating question around reverse logistics, how you keep things moving and always full. I think with food, I think that the large supermarkets are certainly investigating this, and they've all had trials of return and refill, that they're often a disaster in the supermarket setting because you just get sort of honey smeared all over the. So yeah, they're all investigating it, and I think often depends on the object, and it depends on the logistical chain, and I think with food, localization is actually pretty critical. And I think that one of the other things that Returners wants to move into is product services systems. They're already doing that to a certain extent, but he's now wants to work with particular companies and say, when you sell that glass jar of feta, that consumer uses it, then chucks it in the recycling, and then it just goes off into that huge sort of chain of recycling logistics if it's recycled. And so that container is lost to the sort of value system that you're involved in, and you have to buy another one. Why don't we just set up a product services system, pick it up, take it back to you, and you can just refill it? But then they've got to figure out how to get the label off and clean it and all the rest of it. So there are lots of local conversations going on that are really not about scaling up so much, but as diversifying reuse systems into every other possible sort of manifestation you could make. But going big is hard.
There's a question on the Zoom. So I think, do you have it, Mel, or is Aaron going to read it?
I need someone to help me.
Aaron can read it.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So from Cy Taffel. Gay, on the topic of plastics, would you consider the INC 2/3 talks as potential progress, given that they focus on full life cycle and upstream action, acknowledging that reducing use and reuse are the best options? Could we have something similar for microelectronics?
Yeah, I think that those developments are very, very promising, because I think that reuse has not entered into the plastics policy globally nearly as much as it should have. It's only just starting to filter in. And I mean, one of the reasons is that just the huge dominance of the global plastics industry, which doesn't accept any responsibility for the afterlife of its material. But yeah, I think that that's a great development that needs to be really pushed.
Yeah, standards are always our great hope, aren't they? And so I think when it comes to electronics, one of the challenges is the most progressive standards and regulatory environments seem to be Europe-based. And unfortunately, so many of the designs, manufacturing take place either in the US or in the greater Asian region. So how you get those standards to influence globally at scale is really one of the difficulties. So in my experience, pointing to what Europe is doing is sort of what you tell to an American business executive as what's coming. But they're always making a calculation, well, is it coming while I'm going to be in charge, or is it coming later? And so it's a very difficult strategic problem for influencing the right business decisions. But I think also when it comes to scale and local impacts, one thing that Adam Mentor's books have taught me is that, the appetite for cheap consumer goods, bringing those boats from China to American West Coast ports in the first place, is what allowed the scrap trade to then take a lot of American steel and copper back. It may not be the same materials anymore, but it's certainly the case that plastics are being exported back in those empty containers. So I think there's a way that the economics of shipping is still viable. But when it comes to electronics reuse, we do need to have local solutions, because it's just impossible for ordinary consumers to reproduce the manufacturing conditions of such highly complex products. So there are some startups I've seen in the US in the last few years that do focus on door-to-door service of picking up an old laptop from someone's apartment and then delivering it within the same close zip codes, because part of their value proposition is to say we're reducing the carbon footprint of reuse by making our service only available within this strict perimeter. So that's what I mean about the calculations of ESG from now on, is that using this service allows companies to say we're not having to send it back somewhere else to be refurbished, which a lot of the official electronics manufacturers do. Instead, we're keeping it in a very closed geographical footprint. Okay, I don't know. All right, we'll have one more question, but we must keep to time for Thomas.
I'll try and be quick. I mean, just
Okay.
on the question of automation, it seemed to me it's not just about whether that's a market proposition, but also, whether indeed introducing automation doesn't enable forms of data accumulation, which has markets that are independent of the object itself. So that was just a quick observation. But what I really want to ask you about was something you mentioned at the end, which it seemed really critical, which was design elimination. And you didn't really say much about that, because it seemed like there are all sorts of limits to the reuse discourse. I don't think it seems to be, from what the examples you've given, easily generalizable. And there almost needs to be a kind of typology of industries. And so in some, the plastics, it seems like forget reuse. In electronics, it seems more amenable, but we've left out discussion of politics there, really, around class and uneven distribution and who gets to be the sucker that has the crappy phone, these types of things, or the Qantas that wants cheaper tablets because there's a proper margin there. So I'm sort of more interested in this sort of question of design elimination, actually.
Well, look, I mean, yes, each market would have to think, the reuse logic that you could develop there is absolutely specific to that market. and to what it's materially engaged with and how it's logistically organized. With packaging, there are lots of bulk food stalls, for example, elimination design, when nothing's packaged, you bring your own packaging or whatever. Again, they're difficult to scale up. What's happening with reuse in terms of metal containers is that the functionality of packaging is containerization. So to me, it's a really good example of how reuse can work. If you invest in durability and the logistics that requires, rather than destroying the package in its first and only use. So yeah, elimination design is definitely another way to go. We've done a lot of research on that. To me, it's not nearly as interesting as developing what I would call reuse value. Yeah, well, that's very hard. We won't go into other sorts of objects which are quite tricky, yeah. But there's a movement now to bring back milk delivered in glass. Again, a very niche market.
Yes, I've seen it in my neighborhood in Portland. So it's very much not.
They're basically just two-way economies, pick up and deliver. Yeah.
Yeah.
And localization does really matter there because of the cost of them.
Mm-hmm.
But they were in place for a long time. Plastic disrupted all of that, and disposability disrupted all of that.